The mahogany doors of Courtroom 712 swung open as Richard Wellington III strode in, his $10,000 Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. The seasoned business tycoon, worth over $4.2 billion, had never bothered to stand for any judge before, and he wasn't about to start now. As Judge Patricia Thompson entered, every person in the packed courtroom rose to their feet except Wellington. His lips curled into a subtle smirk as he remained seated, his eyes fixed on his golden cufflinks. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Thompson, known for her unwavering integrity and calm demeanor, paused at her bench. Her gaze settled on Wellington, who continued adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate indifference. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for her response to this blatant show of disrespect. What happened next would not only shake Wellington's carefully constructed world but would also become one of the most talked about moments in legal history. Judge Thompson's response would prove that true power lies not in wealth or status, but in something far more valuable, and Wellington was about to learn this lesson in the most unexpected way. Richard Wellington III's path to becoming one of America's most controversial billionaires was paved with ruthless determination and questionable ethics. Born into moderate wealth in Connecticut, he had transformed his father's struggling real estate company into a global empire through a combination of shrewd business acumen and what many called predatory practices. His reputation for hostile takeovers of family-owned businesses had earned him the nickname the corporate shark in financial circles. Wellington's public image was a carefully crafted facade of philanthropy and success, but those who knew him intimately painted a different picture. His former employees spoke in hushed tones about his explosive temper and discriminatory remarks. 3 marriages had ended in bitter divorces, with each ex-wife bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Despite numerous allegations of unfair business practices and discrimination, Wellington had always managed to escape serious consequences, thanks to his army of high-powered attorneys and strategic political donations. His most recent venture had been particularly controversial, the acquisition and demolition of historic buildings in predominantly minority neighborhoods to make way for luxury developments. Community protests had fallen on deaf ears as Wellington's influence with local officials ensured his projects proceeded unimpeded. His dismissive attitude toward public opinion was exemplified in a notorious interview where he stated, "Progress cannot be held hostage by sentiment or tradition." The billionaire's appearance in Judge Thompson's courtroom that day wasn't just another legal proceeding, it was the culmination of years of unchecked arrogance and disregard for others. A class-action lawsuit filed by displaced residents had somehow survived his lawyer's attempts to dismiss it, landing him before the one judge in the circuit known for being impervious to both political pressure and financial influence. Wellington's refusal to stand wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a deliberate challenge to authority from a man who had spent decades believing himself above the law. His closest advisors had warned him about Judge Thompson's reputation for fairness and integrity, but Wellington had brushed off their concerns. "Money talks," he had told them confidently the night before. "And I have more than enough to make sure this nuisance of a case disappears." Little did he know that his actions in Courtroom 712 would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about power, respect, and justice. Richard Wellington III's path to becoming one of America's most controversial billionaires was paved with ruthless determination and questionable ethics. Born into moderate wealth in Connecticut, he had transformed his father's struggling real estate company into a global empire through a combination of shrewd business acumen and what many called predatory practices. His reputation for hostile takeovers of family-owned businesses had earned him the nickname the corporate shark in financial circles. Wellington's public image was a carefully crafted facade of philanthropy and success, but those who knew him intimately painted a different picture. His former employees spoke in hushed tones about his explosive temper and discriminatory remarks. 3 marriages had ended in bitter divorces, with each ex-wife bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Despite numerous allegations of unfair business practices and discrimination, Wellington had always managed to escape serious consequences, thanks to his army of high-powered attorneys and strategic political donations. His most recent venture had been particularly controversial, the acquisition and demolition of historic buildings in predominantly minority neighborhoods to make way for luxury developments. Community protests had fallen on deaf ears as Wellington's influence with local officials ensured his projects proceeded unimpeded. His dismissive attitude toward public opinion was exemplified in a notorious interview where he stated, "Progress cannot be held hostage by sentiment or tradition." The billionaire's appearance in Judge Thompson's courtroom that day wasn't just another legal proceeding, it was the culmination of years of unchecked arrogance and disregard for others. A class action lawsuit filed by displaced residents had somehow survived his lawyer's attempts to dismiss it, landing him before the one judge in the circuit known for being impervious to both political pressure and financial influence. Wellington's refusal to stand wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate challenge to authority from a man who had spent decades believing himself above the law. His closest advisors had warned him about Judge Thompson's reputation for fairness and integrity, but Wellington had brushed off their concerns. "Money talks," he had told them confidently the night before. "And I have more than enough to make sure this nuisance of a case disappears." Little did he know that his actions in Courtroom 712 would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about power, respect, and justice. Judge Patricia Thompson's journey to the federal bench was a testament to perseverance in the face of adversity. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Detroit, she had witnessed firsthand the impact of housing discrimination and corporate exploitation on communities of color. Her parents had lost their family home to a predatory lending scheme, an experience that fueled her determination to pursue a career in law. Despite graduating top of her class from a public high school, she initially couldn't afford college. She worked 2 jobs while attending community college at night, eventually earning a scholarship to law school. Her exceptional academic performance caught the attention of a prominent civil rights attorney who became her mentor, teaching her that true justice required not just knowledge of the law, but unwavering courage to apply it fairly. Throughout her career, Judge Thompson had earned a reputation for being methodical, fair, and impossible to intimidate. She had presided over some of the most high-profile cases in the circuit, including corruption trials of powerful politicians and complex corporate fraud cases. Her rulings were rarely overturned on appeal, thanks to her meticulous attention to legal detail and scrupulous adherence to precedent. What set her apart wasn't just her legal acumen, but her innovative approach to justice. She had pioneered a community service program for white-collar criminals that required them to work directly with the people affected by their actions. Many of her former defendants, humbled by this experience, had become advocates for corporate responsibility and ethical business practices. The morning of Wellington's appearance, Judge Thompson had reviewed his case file extensively. She had seen the photos of elderly residents being evicted, read testimonies of families who had lived in their homes for generations, and studied the complex web of shell companies Wellington had used to obscure his involvement. But what truly concerned her wasn't just the legal implications of his actions, it was the pattern of behavior that suggested a fundamental disrespect for human dignity. The case that brought Wellington to Courtroom 712 began with a small neighborhood called Oak Grove, a historic district that had been home to 3 generations of families. The community was tight-knit, with residents looking after one another and maintaining their modest but well-kept homes with pride. Many residents were retirees who had invested their life savings into these properties, planning to pass them down to their children. Wellington's interest in Oak Grove started when his analysts identified it as a prime location for a luxury shopping complex. The neighborhood's proximity to downtown and its large plot sizes made it an attractive target for development. What followed was a calculated campaign of pressure and manipulation. Wellington's company began buying properties through various shell corporations, offering prices that seemed generous at first glance, but were far below market value considering the area's potential. Those who refused to sell faced increasingly hostile tactics. Mysterious building code violations were reported. Property taxes suddenly skyrocketed due to administrative reassessments. Water and power services experienced unexplained interruptions. The local media, influenced by Wellington's advertising dollars, painted the holdouts as obstacles to economic progress. The breaking point came when Mrs. Eleanor Robinson, a 78-year-old retired schoolteacher and community leader, was forcibly evicted from her home of 45 years. The image of her sitting on her front porch, clutching her late husband's photograph while bailiffs removed her belongings, went viral on social media. It sparked national outrage and caught the attention of a prominent civil rights law firm. The lawyers discovered a pattern of discriminatory practices in Wellington's developments across multiple states. They found evidence of targeted harassment, manipulated property assessments, and violation of housing laws. Most damning were leaked emails showing Wellington's explicit instructions to clean out the undesirables from target neighborhoods. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of 200 displaced residents. Wellington's legal team attempted to bury the case in paperwork and procedural delays, but Judge Thompson, known for her efficiency, fast-tracked the proceedings. The night before the hearing, Wellington had rejected a reasonable settlement offer, confident that his usual tactics of intimidation and financial pressure would prevail. The morning of the hearing, Wellington's demeanor was particularly smug. He had just finalized a deal to acquire another historic neighborhood, and this court appearance was merely an inconvenience in his busy schedule. His refusal to stand for Judge Thompson wasn't just about this case, it was a message to everyone who dared to challenge his authority. As he sat there, adjusting his cufflinks and smirking, Wellington failed to notice something crucial about Judge Thompson's expression. Unlike other authority figures he had encountered, there was no anger or indignation in her eyes. Instead, there was something far more unsettling, a calm, knowing look that suggested she had seen his kind before and knew exactly how to handle them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. Judge Thompson's response to Wellington's disrespect sent shockwaves through the legal community. Instead of citing him for contempt, as everyone expected, she simply smiled and addressed the courtroom with remarkable composure. "Mr. Wellington's choice to remain seated offers us a unique opportunity," she began, her voice carrying clear authority. "Today's proceedings will continue without recess until Mr. Wellington chooses to show this court the same respect he expects from others." What followed was a marathon, 12-hour session. While other cases were heard, Wellington was required to remain in his seat. No breaks were allowed unless he stood to acknowledge the court's authority. His lawyers squirmed uncomfortably as their client's face grew increasingly red with frustration. The media, initially gathered for the class action hearing, now had an even bigger story unfolding before them. By hour 6, Wellington's Italian suit was wrinkled, and his polished demeanor had cracked. The judge methodically worked through her docket, occasionally glancing at Wellington with the same knowing smile. The wealthy businessman who had never been denied anything found himself trapped by his own arrogance. Several times, his attorneys attempted to intervene, but Judge Thompson firmly reminded them that their client's comfort was entirely in his own hands. The story spread like wildfire across social media. #WellingtonWatch began trending as people shared updates from the courtroom. Political cartoonists had a field day, depicting the billionaire squirming in his seat while Justice, portrayed as a blindfolded figure, smiled knowingly. Even Wellington's usual allies in the business community maintained a diplomatic silence, unwilling to defend such a clear display of disrespect for the judicial system. As the day wore on, the courtroom became increasingly crowded. Among the spectators were several of Wellington's former employees and residents from Oak Grove, watching with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief as the man who had upended their lives faced his own moment of powerlessness. Mrs. Eleanor Robinson sat in the front row, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to Wellington's growing discomfort. The most revealing moments came during the brief conversations Judge Thompson had with other defendants, many of whom were low-income individuals facing minor charges. She treated each one with the same respect and attention she would have given to a prestigious attorney. The contrast between her behavior and Wellington's arrogance became increasingly apparent to everyone in the courtroom, including Wellington himself. Judge Thompson's masterful handling of Wellington's defiance extended far beyond that initial confrontation. In the following days, she implemented what many would later call the Thompson method, a sophisticated approach to reforming entitled behavior through carefully calculated consequences. Instead of the standard courtroom procedures, she ordered Wellington to attend every hearing of displaced residents, requiring him to listen to their stories without interruption. Each morning, he was made to wait in line with other defendants, no special treatment allowed. His requests for private meetings were consistently denied, and his high-priced lawyers found their usual tactics ineffective against the judge's methodical approach. The judge also ordered an unusual form of evidence presentation. Rather than allowing Wellington's lawyers to present dry financial documents, she required walking tours of the affected neighborhoods. Wellington, accompanied by court officers, had to personally visit each property his company had acquired. At each stop, former residents shared their memories, their losses, and the impact of his actions on their lives. The media coverage was relentless. Photographers captured images of Wellington, his expensive suits growing increasingly rumpled, trudging through the neighborhoods he had once viewed only through tinted car windows. His company's stock price began to fluctuate as investors questioned his judgment. Board members started expressing concerns about the negative publicity's impact on their other business interests. Most significantly, Judge Thompson ordered a comprehensive audit of all Wellington's development projects over the past decade. She appointed a special master to investigate not just the legal aspects, but the human cost of his business practices. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that shocked even his strongest supporters. Throughout it all, Judge Thompson maintained her composed demeanor, treating Wellington with unwavering professionalism. Her approach wasn't about punishment, it was about education. She was forcing him to experience the consequences of his actions in a way that no fine or traditional penalty could achieve. The weight of Judge Thompson's ordered community visits began to take its toll on Wellington. One rainy evening, after another exhausting day of testimonies, he found himself alone in his penthouse office, staring at the city lights below. The empire he'd built now felt hollow, its foundation cracking under the weight of truth. That morning, he'd met a former resident who had taught mathematics at the local high school for 30 years. The man had shown Wellington his students' thank-you letters, preserved carefully even after being evicted from his home. For the first time, Wellington saw beyond property values and profit margins. He saw lives, memories, communities. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from board members and investors, but Wellington let them go to voicemail. Instead, he found himself reviewing old photographs of his own childhood home, remembering how his father had always emphasized the importance of treating people with dignity. When had he strayed so far from those values? The turning point came during a visit to Mrs. Robinson's former home. Now just an empty lot, she had pointed to a bare patch of earth where her garden once bloomed. Every spring, she had said, without bitterness, I planted flowers here so the neighborhood children could learn about nature. Wellington had turned away, but not before she noticed the tears in his eyes. His late-night research revealed something surprising. Cities where developers had worked with communities rather than against them had actually achieved better long-term profits. The realization hit him hard. His approach hadn't just been morally wrong, it had been unnecessarily destructive. Wellington's transformation began with a surprising announcement to his board of directors. He proposed a complete overhaul of their development strategy, starting with Oak Grove. Instead of demolition, he presented plans for community-led renovation projects that would preserve historic homes while adding modern amenities. The board members were skeptical until they saw the potential for both profit and positive publicity. He reached out to Mrs. Robinson, requesting her help in forming a community advisory board. Initially met with suspicion, his sincerity became evident as he implemented every suggestion they made. The revised plans included affordable housing units, green spaces, and a community center named after longtime residents. The media, which had delighted in his downfall, now found themselves covering a different story. Wellington was spotted having coffee with former residents, listening to their stories, and taking notes. He visited local businesses, learning about their importance to the community. His expensive suits were replaced by casual attire as he walked the neighborhoods, not as an owner, but as a student of community building. Judge Thompson observed these changes without comment, but those in her courtroom noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. The daily hearings continued, but now included discussions of restoration rather than demolition. Wellington's lawyers presented new proposals focusing on community preservation and economic uplift. The most telling moment came during a town hall meeting. When a resident accused him of making changes just for show, Wellington admitted his past wrongs, without defensiveness. "You're right to be suspicious," he said, "I've earned that. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I'm asking for a chance to make things right." The mahogany doors of courtroom 712 swung open as Richard Wellington III strode in, his $10,000 Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. The seasoned business tycoon, worth over $4.2 billion, had never bothered to stand for any judge before, and he wasn't about to start now. As Judge Patricia Thompson entered, every person in the packed courtroom rose to their feet except Wellington. His lips curled into a subtle smirk as he remained seated, his eyes fixed on his golden cufflinks. Previous parts remained the same. 1 year after that fateful day in courtroom 712, Wellington stood before Judge Thompson again. This time, he was the first to rise when she entered. The courtroom was packed, but not with protesters or angry residents. Instead, community members had gathered to witness the final approval of the Oak Grove Preservation and Development Plan. Wellington's company had not only restored displaced residents to their homes, but had created a revolutionary model of community-centered development. Property values had increased, but longtime residents were protected through innovative legal agreements he'd developed with fair housing experts. The community center buzzed with activity, offering job training, financial literacy classes, and youth programs. Mrs. Robinson, now heading the Community Advisory Board, presented the results of their first year. Crime rates had dropped, local businesses were thriving, and young families were moving back to the area. The project had become a case study in ethical urban development, with delegations from other cities visiting to learn from their example. Judge Thompson's final ruling went beyond the original case. She established the Thompson Doctrine, a legal framework requiring developers to demonstrate community benefit in their projects. Wellington's company became the first to voluntarily adopt these standards across all their developments. At the ceremony naming the community center, Wellington reflected on his journey. "A year ago, I thought power came from wealth and influence," he told the gathered crowd. "Judge Thompson taught me that true power lies in the strength of communities and the dignity of every individual. My greatest achievement isn't the buildings we've preserved or the programs we've started, it's learning to stand up for what's right by first learning to stand up in respect for others." The story of Wellington's transformation became legend in legal and business circles, not because a billionaire had been humbled, but because it proved that change was possible at any age, at any level of success. Judge Thompson's wisdom in choosing education over punishment had not only reformed one man, but had created a ripple effect of positive change throughout the business world. Years later, when asked about the incident, Judge Thompson would simply smile and say, "Justice isn't about bringing people low. It's about lifting everyone up to their highest potential." The Oak Grove community stands as a living testament to this philosophy, where every morning, people from all walks of life gather in its renovated streets, proud to be part of a story that proved respect and dignity, not wealth, are the true measures of success.